podcast, Coping with COVID-19 from the Journalists at Business in Vancouver. I'm Kirk LaPointe, publisher and editor-in-chief. The pandemic prompted a lot of economic disruption, of course, and while we focused much attention on the impact on businesses directly, we haven't looked as much at the consumer picture, the spending side and the debt side. We're getting our first real picture of the pandemic's effects with the release of quarter data on consumer credit. And not surprisingly, there were immediate changes in behavior. Bill Johnston is the Vice President of Data and Analytics at Equifax Canada, one of the leading firms that examines data and provides companies with a lot of advice on such matters as credit and debt and those kinds of scores. Good to have you with us.
Nice to be with you.
Well, let's start. The coronavirus was approaching us for months, but there was a point in March when it seemed everyone around us just understood we had to shut the doors and stay inside. So what did the consumer do then?
That's where we saw the pivot. So when we looked at January, February data, things were okay. We get a lot of credit inquiries when you go shop for a car or credit card. People will come to us and get your credit file. Our numbers were, in line and we're growing and, kind of had followed the same trend. And then mid-March came and shutdown started. And so we saw a big shift in consumer behavior where they were looking for less credit, using credit cards significantly less than they had been. And so that's where we really saw the change in behavior. Wasn't really until the shutdown started.
Is it do you think fear, just restraint, prudence, would mixture of all those things?
A little bit of everything, really. I think part of it's just there was nowhere to go shop. And so, getting new credit cards wasn't important. Getting, a new car wasn't important, was when auto dealers were closed. And so part of it was just the availability to go actually and do things. And then I think there was a bit of a fear, particularly in the first few weeks, around what will the impact be? Who's going to have layoffs? What will the government response be? And so it was really a mixture, but it wasn't necessarily all fear driven. And that's partly why, the recovery may be okay, because I don't think this was people just out of fear.
Yeah, I want to get back to that psyche bit a little later on, but you mentioned right away that it wasn't all that clear on how government was going to weigh in right away with how substantial it was going to be about any of this. Did consumers keep their cool, or did they start turning to look for debt for support?
We saw very little of that, and it was definitely one of our concerns. Were people going to use credit cards and lines of credit in particular to help the first few weeks? And we did not see that, and credit card spending in particular was down significantly.
Huh.
And so we didn't see any real turn, and that was our biggest concern. And we didn't see a turn to credit to help through those early weeks. People were able to get through the first little while, really without having to worry about that.
So they probably turned to their savings, but did consumers reach out, say, for new lines of credit and new instruments to, give them some kind of safety net if the worst started to happen, or did they just again, say someone's going to take care of this?
I think the biggest change was really this idea of payment deferrals, and so where we definitely saw a lot of demand was people phoning their FIs and saying, "Hey, can I, defer my mortgage payments for 3 months or 6 months?" And so that's where we definitely saw a strong reaction, was people just looking for those payment help as opposed to getting new credits. So that was really a very, very significant tool for them in the early days.
Yeah, this was the first decline that you've noted in average balances in a decade. I take it back about 11 years to the 11 or 12 years to the 2008 meltdown. And is this typically what happens when there's a significant economic event, or was the arrival of the pandemic a little different?
The pandemic was definitely different. And so even in the financial crisis, we didn't really see declines in credit use. I mean, people continued to use, and probably you saw a little bit more of that using credit as a crutch.
Mm-hmm.
I think in this case, and a lot of it really had to do with the retail shutdown, is because I didn't have places to spend and I didn't have to buy gas because I wasn't going to a place of work. I think that ability to really reduce your spending really helped mitigate this time. Whereas in the financial crisis, quite honestly, there was a bit of a turn to credit to help out especially in those kind of early days of the downturn.
Of course, most people still have their work, and some are rolled back on wages and reduced hours and so on, but work is still there. But what do you think the effect of the government programs have been on essentially preventing people from getting too far away from their limits around credit, around debt?
We definitely think it's been a help. I mean, one of the things that was very evident was, younger people in particular were most impacted by this, and so I'd say kind of your vulnerable kind of employees, service-based, food, retail, and we haven't really seen them really have any challenges. Their delinquency rates haven't gone up in the week since. They've been paying down their credit cards. Actually, young people had the most significant decline in their credit card use. And so we haven't seen kind of any of that concern. And part of the fact is that things like CURB have helped to offset some of that.
Mm-hmm. I want to explore that, the generational and demographic differences that you've noticed in the data. Why do you, apart from CERB and other types of programs, why didn't we see a lot of younger borrowers trip up in this situation?
Again, I think a lot of it was that there wasn't a lot to do. There wasn't places to go spend. You weren't going to buy a new trip to Jamaica or Mexico. These kind of big ticket items sort of weren't on the table right now. And so there wasn't this push or demand. Mm-hmm. There were some relief programs. A lot of the younger people, particularly those impacted with the most significant job losses, typically aren't homeowners. They're typically renters. And so I think there was an opportunity here where they didn't have to worry about going out and buying a lot of stuff. And so there was a period of time where the shutdown actually kind of helped them, at least not having to go out and buy a lot of things, or, go buy things just because they could.
Yeah. Mortgage activity, of course, continued to grow. Was that just a lag from, numbers that have been growing all along pre-pandemic?
Yeah, and there's always a bit of a delay. So I buy my house in February, but the mortgage I don't get till I close in March. And so we know some of that just had to do with the fact that we had really strong demand kind of going into 2020 for mortgages. We also saw strong mortgage refinance activity, especially as the Bank of Canada sort of slashed their interest rates. And so, what we saw was the mortgage did decline. We definitely saw a decline in volume kind of late, very, very late March and into April. And it's really seen a bit of a recovery. And so as markets reopen and, home sales were fairly strong in the last month, we'll start to see mortgage kind of recovering a little quicker.
There's an interesting piece of British Columbia data in all of this that I want to review on it. Our province has been leading the country in the growth of debt delinquency. What's happening there?
Well, the good news is it's because you're also the lowest. So you're coming out very, very low levels. And so BC has been a really strong market. Part of what happened, particularly as your housing market slowed, actually your credit growth in general slowed. So even non-mortgage debt was slowing or just not growing as quickly as some other markets. And so that kind of leads to some delinquency as well, just by mathematical equation. And so overall, BC is performing very well, and its delinquency rates are still at very, very low levels, especially on the mortgage side. It's actually very, very low. And so not a concerning point, but was a trend even pre-COVID that we've been tracking for a while.
So we haven't suddenly become irresponsible.
No, actually, if anything, the fact that your credit growth had been slowing and moderating were actually a sign that you were changing, adjusting to your marketplace. So it's actually quite a positive trend.
Yeah, well, we seem to flatten the curve fastest in Canada. We might as well deal with that as well too. So your data indicates that the trends moved into April as well, into the second quarter, and you think the worst is behind us. What do you think that spells out now as we start to reopen the economy across the country?
I mean, I think the first positive thing is that there may not be a big psychological break. So we are starting to see, demand for auto and demand for mortgages coming back. And so it was one of the areas that we were watching for. Auto had been relatively modest for the last year or so, where we saw new car sales flatten out. But we're starting to see it come back, and it's still not back to the previous levels, but it was one of the hardest hit groups, kind of March, early April, and we're seeing that coming back almost to normal, alongside mortgage. So we're starting to see, particularly things that are a little bit bigger ticket, coming back a little faster than I think we would have expected. At least at the depths of this in early April.
And does the acceleration of things like online shopping, really kind of suggests that the consumer won't take as long to come back as as we almost did to fall in to the pandemic closures?
We do expect a pretty decent recovery. I think we started to see some shift from offline to online. We had some credit card data that we were looking at. But I think you will start to see, as jobs come back online and as retail starts to open back up, we may not get back to the levels we were in January, February, but I don't think we'll see the depths we're at now. So I do think we'll see a strong recovery through the summer, both in terms of credit card spending and again, in the auto and mortgage markets, we do expect to see a pretty decent recovery.
Yeah, the one area, and maybe I'm not sure if this is in your bailiwick or not, but I've been really surprised that there hasn't been a grand growth in credit cards that will basically take all of your large debt and consolidate it into low or almost no interest at all. People have been rather surprised at that. People have consolidated their debt into lower instruments and have continued to carry credit card debt that can be rather high in all of this. What do you think is going on there?
It's just been a trend that's been around for a long time. I mean, I used to manage lines of credit years ago, and we always expected people to just take their credit card balance and put it on the lines of credit. And so I think people really compartmentalize their debt and don't always think about that. And when they think debt consolidation, it tends to be, one big bang that I do a whole bunch at once. They don't always think about moving between different credit instruments. And it's an education process. It's something that, over time people can start to learn, but it's probably not something that we always teach people, particularly young people, as they start to learn how to use credit.
Sure. Last question. I wonder what you've seen out of all of this data and the behavioral patterns around it to suggest how people might have changed almost permanently in terms of their own habits. Are there any things that you're picking up on that you think will be permanent, the post pandemic, or as we move along through the pandemic and feel a little bit more open about economic activity?
No, I mean, I think we haven't seen anything that we think will be a long-term impact where people will just, from a psychological perspective, not really want to get back into markets. We do think there'll be a decent recovery. We do think it'll look at a little bit different. So things like travel are going to take much longer to recover. And so I think that's one where psychology will play a part. But as jobs come back, I think you will start to see people coming back into their previous behavior and actually probably catching up a little bit. So that's why I think there will be a pretty solid recovery, at least through the summer. I think the challenge will be, what's the discussion around a second or third wave? And does that start to make people say, well, I'm not going to run up credit right now, because if there's a second wave, I want to be ready. So I don't think we'll get right back to where we were pre-COVID, but we do think we'll get a pretty decent recovery. That said, I think there will be some sub-segments of people who will be a little longer, a little slower to recover, particularly younger people. Those people who are in the service industries where jobs won't recover as quickly probably will take longer to get back to normal in terms of their spending behavior and kind of their use of credit.
Yeah. Very interesting discussion, Bill. You're sitting on top of a lot of interesting data right now, and hope to get back in touch with you as we get through this, and maybe even toward that second wave, understand what we're starting to enter again. I want to appreciate your time today, and we'll talk to you again.
Great. Thank you.
Bill Johnston is the Vice President of Data Analytics at Equifax Canada. You've been watching Coping with COVID-19, the daily business podcast from BIV. I'm Kirk LaPointe. Thanks a lot for watching.